Welcome. My name is Phil Redman. I'm the offering manager for ESG here at OneTrust. Welcome to our discussion. Fresh out of COP26, the IFRS have announced the formation of the new International Sustainability Standards Boards. And this is going to help create a global baseline for sustainability disclosure standards. So today I have with me a guest, Philipp von Bieberstein. He's the Chief Commercial Officer from Climatiq. And we're going to talk a little bit about what this means and what the announcement is really going to do. So welcome, Phil. Tell us a little bit about yourself and Climatiq.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. Two Phillips on the call. My name is Philip. I am one of the founders and the Chief Commercial Officer at Climatiq. Climatiq is really automating the collection and estimation of carbon emissions for organizations. We mostly work with software developers to integrate the estimation, like the estimates and the calculation of emissions into their software, as well as with large corporates that have their own IT department.
Oh, that's great. So super exciting announcement from COP26 today. As probably many of you know, this is a big UN-based summit, hundreds of countries, prime ministers and presidents from all over the world, and lots of news coming out of Glasgow, Scotland this week, especially around climate. And so one of the bigger announcements that we've seen is this announcement from the IFRS. You probably know the IFRS for doing their accounting standards, especially very big in Europe. Not as well adopted here in the United States, but we have GAAP counting, but certainly very well recognized industry organization. For the first time, they're really addressing kind of what are the standards for public companies, for any type of company really, and what they're doing in the climate. And so what they've announced today is this formation of a new board. It's called the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB. You're going to get lots of acronyms and letters flying around now. And they're going to develop a comprehensive global baseline, they hope high quality standards, for disclosure statements that really will help bring a uniformity and consistency to the way that companies are going to report what they're doing for climate. And so the standards will give companies kind of this consistent ESG data and metrics that will allow investors to easily compare companies and make valuation discussions, eliminate greenwashing issues potentially, and really kind of focus on the numbers, right? Financial statements, sustainability, performance data, and what that impact will be. And so this ISSB will sit alongside their regular accounting standards board, so the IASB, to kind of ensure that there's that consistency across, the different teams, and that they're really bringing in a number of different current ESG standards groups. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. To support this. So it can really move towards a reduction of the number of types of disclosures or different types of metrics and frameworks that are out there. And I think that's very welcome in the industry. So tell me, Philip, what do you think? Like, what's your first thought around this? What does this all mean?
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I looked through the press announcement earlier today, and I think there was a live announcement as well about, and what really struck me is that the IFRS has managed to get all these critical bodies together. Everybody's under one hood, and everybody's trying to work this out together. So all the critical bodies like SASB, the CDP, even the TCFD standards, which are so far been adopted by various organizations if they want to disclose their carbon emissions. And now they're all under one hood, and they're all going to work together to develop this one set of guidelines. You call it a baseline, according to which companies have to do their carbon or their climate reporting in general. So I think that's a really, really great step. You can only hope that it has the same impact down the line as even the IFRS standards had initially as well.
Yeah, because that's been a huge issue, right, with companies on which framework or standard they should have. And it's been difficult to compare across different companies and organizations because they may choose different frameworks and metrics. And so there's no kind of comparison that's easily be done. So you think this will help eliminate, some of that confusion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been so much confusion on this that we've been seeing. Obviously, the CDP has and SASB are the big ones that companies have followed, and they're trying to build like compatibility systems. But as an organization, you didn't really know what to do. You don't know exactly what guidelines to follow, how detailed, how granular you should report, which how do you do scope 1, scope 2, but what do you about scope 3 reporting, which scope 3 reporting, for those of you on the audience who don't know, is the whole supply chain.
Right.
Scope 2 is the energy we're using. Scope 1 is what we are causing as an organization ourselves. And it's not really clear how do I account for what. And so we really hope for these standards to set a global, or the standards board to set a global standard for organizations to follow and clear away that confusion.
Right. And so the standards, they say, will come in the second half of 2022. So next year, and we'll probably see some of the first reporting in 2023. But it seems like they're going to primarily focus just on the climate piece, where a lot of organizations were looking to kind of expand beyond just climate. You think that will be any issue for uptake, because some organizations may want to go beyond just thinking around climate, especially?
Well, I think the uptake, well, I hope that the uptake will be good, and I hope the uptake will be led by some big organizations. But Phil, you raise a really good point. It's not really clear what climate and sustainability data actually means in that context. So we don't, the announcement has not actually revealed any details around that so far. So it's not clear whether we're going to talk about, greenhouse gas emissions. Do we talk about water usage, waste, land use? Do we talk about biodiversity? And what about, let alone that, and the social governance, social and working conditions? All these things is unclear to me what will be part of those standards and whatnot.
Yeah, for sure. I think the one thing we can say, though, that the consistency of having these metrics, the transparency that will drive organizations with the reporting capabilities, it's really going to help, we hope, engender more trust, with what's going on. And, obviously we want to move towards a more sustainable and regenerative area, but we think that, at least getting to this kind of consistency and international standards will help, investors, stakeholders be able to make better decisions. And then that by understanding more of what that organization is involved in and be able to compare across organizations, help them make better decisions, and then engender that trust overall, which we think is really important as companies are looking to, be more involved and have more of those trustful relationships, whether it's with their investors, their employees, or their customers, and any of those stakeholders. No doubt about that.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
When we think about, go ahead.
No, I said absolutely. I want to hone in on
Yeah.
the investor comment, because I think investors in particularly are looking almost desperately for clear guidance on what their portfolio looks like in terms of ESG data. And it's not clear today. And if I want to have a green portfolio, I don't know whether my portfolio, what kind of color it has, if you want, and how green I actually have.
Right. Yeah, and I guess, obviously there's requirements for reporting. We'll probably see these come out maybe annually. They'll start with annually reporting in these areas.
Yeah, I think that's already happening. I think we see some of that happening. I think we always, as a small country, but New Zealand is quite progressive with that. You now have to report annually, not just on how the climate affects the organization, but also how the organization affects the climate. And they're quite progressive, and we think other countries will follow. I know the EU is looking to pass regulation on mandatory carbon disclosure. That may also have an impact on trade, by the way. As part of the Green New Deals, there's some rules being discussed there. And I think the SEC in the US is discussing something similar, Phil. I think you know the US obviously better.
Yeah, so the SEC, they're also looking to come out with some of their own metrics for publicly listed companies, and they've kind of committed that by the end of the year they're going to come out with what that'll be. And so whether that's going to be based on TCFD, or maybe they'll pick up this IFRS piece of that and look to that. So of course, I think in the US we like to do our own thing, it seems. So most likely it'll come out with something separate, unfortunately. But I think what it just shows is that everybody sees the importance of this and the importance of how it's going to drive more investments in the future. And try to certainly reduce the amount of greenwashing that's out there, by bringing in kind of hard data and a lot of metrics in there, so that, again, be able to make decisions better. So if we think a little bit more about the future now, so what do you think we're going to see the impact from this standard? What do you think will be some of the key things that'll be the biggest impact?
So I think generally I think sometimes these things are a bit technical, but they can have a very large impact, because all of a sudden everybody follows their own reporting standards and their own guidance on it. So if that becomes law, that can be a huge impact, because it brings transparency to an area that's quite intransparent today. However, we have to kind of observe what happens with the local in each jurisdiction, whether they're able to put this into actual law, and what the law will actually look like, and what is the requirement for companies to follow.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. There's no mandate that anyone has to use these. At the same time, the UK has already, moved towards regulating in the use of TCFD. So it'll be interesting to see how, what that changes. Now, there is a chance too, though, that, this could become what we call more of a de facto standard. So even if it isn't mandated into law, companies can choose to do it on their own. So there's nothing stopping them from doing that for sure. So it'll be interesting to see what that uptake is and how they'll influence their supplier partners and third parties also if they want to use those standards for comparing, like if they're part of their supply chain. So that still is a pretty open question about what the uptake is. I haven't heard too much yet from many companies and what they're doing, but they might want to wait and see what those metrics are first too, right?
I think that is a really good point, Phil, and I think that we're going to see significant uptake from large corporates that act under jurisdictions or in areas where there's a lot of sensitivity to the topic. And we are seeing, already in the voluntary market and voluntary disclosures, a lot of activity happening. A lot of companies pledge to become net zero, or at least carbon neutral, and they need to account for that. They need to understand what standards to follow, and I expect them to embrace this, actually, these policies. And I would expect these more progressive companies to lead, and then by some of the more, say, old-fashioned traditional companies to follow suit. And then you would have a de facto standard, like you said. Yeah.
And probably what will happen is, if their competitors or again, if their partners are using it, it's more likely to be adopted. But again, it's going to come back to there's always that balance between, okay, here are new metrics. Does that mean there's new data we need to get? Are there new ways we need to try to find that data? And that's a huge challenge in this industry right now is finding that data without having to, have so many resources, so much time and money in order to kind of come up with those metrics. So I think it's going to be a tricky balance for the board to really come up with metrics that are impactful, but at the same time that are actually reasonable, that can be, actually the data can be gotten from it.
Yeah, and obviously that's what we do at Climatiq. And I think one of the real questions that we're going to observe closely is to what extent these IFRS standards and the regulation that may follow mandate Scope 3 emissions. So, we talked earlier about Scope 3, but Scope 3 emissions, so your supply chain upstream and downstream emissions, cause 90% of your emissions on average. So that needs to be encompassed in that reporting. But then that's really, really hard to do if you have a supplier halfway across the world that does paper receipts and you don't really know how to include that and how accurate that is. The devil is in the detail here.
Yeah. So let's touch real briefly back on one more thing that we kind of started talking about and just discuss maybe a little bit more. So as part of this announcement was this commitment by these leading focused sustainability disclosure organizations to join this. So that's kind of historic right there, right? And so we kind of talked a little bit about it, but they're going to consolidate things like the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, so CDSB. So that's I think they're pretty excited by that. That's a big initiative from the CDP. And then, of course, the kind of fairly new Value Reporting Foundation, which is, the SASB standards. So it looks like they're going to go both kind of horizontal, very general standards, and then maybe also get into some industry-specific standards too that they're looking at. So, what do you think the impact will be then of companies who are using CDSB today or SASB? Anything that they may be thinking about on would they be most likely to migrate towards these new standards that are coming up?
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure both of those standards will offer migrations. I know the CDP is already working quite closely with the SASB provider and to kind of understand how compatibility between these two standards. So I think that's probably doable. I think there's so many other bodies that have a voice under that new ISSB board. So they might have to find political compromises that hopefully will be bold and progressive. And we have to observe that. But I think that will be good to see. I'm less worried about SASB and CDP because they're already working together quite closely. I'm more worried about all these other parties now joining the party and trying to find one global standard and to understand, does that actually have a really big impact on the climate, or will they pass like some small? Will the standard be rather kind of small and not very impactful? That's something to be observed.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the more popular ones that we've seen out there, GRI, which is very extensive. It goes well beyond just the environmental and climate piece. Still has a great place. Again, especially if it sounds like these standards might be very climate focused versus, as we mentioned before, more extensive, getting into things like diversity, equity, inclusion, community, all that. And a lot of organizations that we talk to, they want something at least that's representative of both the E and the S, if not the G, to give a more holistic view and idea of that for their stakeholders and viewers.
Yeah, I think that's
any.
I hope that
any last comments?
So,
yeah, for sure. Any last comments, thoughts you want to leave everyone with?
Yeah, as for us, it's a very exciting development. As I said earlier, I think it's a very good start. We're going to observe this very, very closely. If done well, I think this could have a major impact on how companies report on climate, and with that additional transparency, there'll be more incentives for them to act on it as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. So just to summarize, right, we've seen today coming out of COP26 a creation of a new standards boards focused just on climate. So the ISSB, you'll be hearing more about those initials over the next 4 to 6 months, I'm sure. And so these standards will give a consistent set of rules to companies to report on their ESG data. Primarily, it looks like focused on climate, but it still remains to be seen, right? But the idea is this will allow investors to really compare across different companies the same metrics. So if everybody's on the same standards, using the same data, right, it makes it much more comparable. And we'll give a lot more insights, whether it's to investors or stakeholders, what that company's actually doing, for the environment and for climate. And so hopefully help reduce some of the kind of greenwashing issues that we've been seeing out there. Now, the adoption, it's really up in the air by companies. So there's no mandates today. From countries haven't said and jumped in and said that we're going to mandate this. So it still remains to be seen whether countries or companies are going to adopt these things. And the standards, are also still not going to be available until the second half of next year. So, we wouldn't really see anybody reporting and using these until probably reporting on them in 2023, maybe even the end of 2023. So it's still a ways off, but it's really fascinating and great to see, this kind of unification coming together and progress on how we're reporting on the environment and the climate at organizations, especially public organizations. So I'd like to thank Philipp for joining me today on this discussion. I think it was super interesting. Really appreciate that. We are going to have a webinar that's going to cover not just this, but all of the COP26 major announcements. It's going to be on December 8th. So please join me and our lead of our Center of Excellence, Pam, around all the things that are coming out from this conference and help you kind of guide you in decisions that you'll be making. So once again, thanks, Philipp. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank you, Phil. Bye-bye.